On her wedding night she begged him to blow out the lamp, because no one, not even her husband, had ever seen her real face. But when he quietly locked the door, he discovered a truth that her village had hidden for 25 years. The wedding had been a storm of color and noise that smelled of fried plantain and jasmine. In the village of Kifaru, a stretch of red earth roads and mango trees that leaned like listening elders, people came as if the air itself had been summoned to celebrate. Bright cloths flashed, drums ate the sunset, and children burst through crowds like sparks. Sifa sat on a low wooden stool, fingers folded in her lap, and let the world wash over her in a rhythm she had learned to copy like a practiced smile. Her makeup was a ritual, not because she loved the weight of rouge or the discipline of a winged liner, but because makeup was her armor. On the narrow strip of stalls where she sold beaded necklaces and second-hand radio parts, those colors kept the men from thinking they could step into the hollow spaces of her life and take what they pleased. People called her proud, sometimes cold. Wo Kupsarat Hai Magar Apni Chairs Bizayada Apni Shan Pazand Hai, Aunt Rukia would whisper, rolling her eyes, but Sifa knew it was survival in a place where surviving meant keeping a private life private. She had met Idris 3 months earlier outside the mosque, when he returned to Kifaru from the city with his suit still creased from the plane ride and a laugh that sounded like money. He was the kind of man villages sighed over, broad-shouldered, educated, a cousin of the district officer, and crucially not from here. There was a rumor that his family had ties to a far-off bank, and another rumor that his grandmother wore gold so thick she made the sun waver. Idris watched Sifa the way someone reads a book they mean to keep. He did not mimic the scandalous curiosity of the others. Instead he asked small, careful questions. Where did you learn to bead like that? Who taught you the patterns? What do you read when the power goes out? When your stall was rained on? He helped fold the tarpaulin and offered tea he probably paid for with a wallet that never showed a dent. The village said he was running away from a marriage arranged in the city, that he liked the quiet pain of being different. But Sifa thought it was simpler. He was kind where kindness might as well have been rare linen. Love in Kifaru did not look like the novels the schoolchildren imagined. It arrived messy, often clumsily, over days of borrowed sugar, shared umbrellas, and arguments about whether the mango trees needed pruning. They kept things small for weeks. Secret walks behind the dispensary, late-night confessions under a borrowed radio, the promise that if either of them stepped out of line the other would tug them back. When he proposed, he gave her a ring that fit her like a question that finally got an answer. She said yes because in the city he wore the same suit twice, because he could name the constellations and had a soft way of saying "tum" when nobody else used it. The wedding involved more than 2 people. Families interlaced like woven mats, and duties were assigned like roles in a play. Sifa's mother cried rivers that she called blessings. Her father nodded in a way that meant he had a stomach full of gratitude and a head full of heavy thoughts. Idris's family arrived on polished buses, their laughter a quieter starched sound. His mother, Halima, moved through the crowd with a measured hand, her bracelets chiming like a clock. She spoke little, but when she did, the words felt like decisions. Sifa's makeup that day was more precise than ever, a pale sweep that made her cheekbones a line of lighthouse, brows filed into small dark crescents, lips a simple defiant shade of berry. People loved it or resented it, but no one could erase it. It sat on her skin like a map of choices she had already carved. There was meaning in every brush, a defense against pity, a message to men who thought they could read her without turning pages. She tapped a little more powder on, blew at her braid, and stepped into a future that looked strange and promising. They left the wedding with the village singing behind them. The couple rode in a battered car borrowed from an uncle, and as the engine coughed them toward Idris's family compound, Sifa watched the world shear into new shapes through the window. Her thoughts were both light and anchored. The sound of drums was still in her chest, and the image of her mother's hand, calloused but clean, pressed against her own was a compass. Idris held her hand without squeezing, as if contact could be a prayer. The family compound in the city, though calling it a compound made it feel small, it was more a house that had absorbed other houses, stood at the end of a paved lane lined with palms. A high gate, black iron with curled vines, announced itself like a guardian. Inside, servants in neat uniforms bowed with a silence that spoke of training. There were sofas that swallowed people and a chandelier that refracted secrets. Idris led her through halls that smelled of lemon oil and something faintly floral, the sort of scent Halima favored when she wanted guests to remember decency. Sifa's eyes adjusted to lights that never dimmed. Paintings lined the walls, frames heavy as claims. Family portraits sat in sit-down grandeur, stern faces with the glossy truth of inherited pride. There was a photograph of Idris as a boy on a dirt patch, teeth crooked, running toward a soccer ball. Beside it, a more recent image showed him in a suit, graduation cap tipped like a crown. On the mantel, an antique clock ticked the same steady rhythm as the careful servant's footsteps. That night, after cousins had congratulated and elders had offered syrupy blessings, Idris brought Sifa to the room they would share. It had curtains the color of dusk and a bed that looked like a small island. Sifa had expected nervous fumbling and a swarm of awkwardness. She had not expected Halima to place a small, sealed envelope on the dressing table with an expression like a judge closing a case. "From the family," Halima said, her voice the same even calm as she set the envelope down. It was ceremonial as a verdict. She did not stay to explain. She had done what she came to do. Sifa sat in front of the mirror and opened it like a letter. Inside was a single photograph, glossy and cold. It was a picture of a woman who looked a lot like Sifa. Same eyes, same slope of cheek. Only younger, smiling in a dress that spoke of another time. On the back, a name was written in a handwriting that Sifa knew without reading it. Amina, class of 92. For an instant, the room tilted. Sifa's breath got stuck on the rim of that photograph. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell. Stories of a sister whose fate was washed away across towns. Stories told half laughed at and half snuffed out. The family in the compound had known a name that Sifa's family had only ever let out in whispers. The hair on her arms lifted like the first sign of rain. "Do you know her?" Idris asked, soft, as if the question itself might fracture something delicate. Sifa's mouth made one slow movement and then stopped. She felt the practiced armor of her makeup even more as if it were suddenly too thin. "My mother used to," she began then stopped. It was easier to keep silence, to let the photograph sit between them like a third person who would not speak. Idris looked at the picture for longer than was polite. "She looks like you," he said finally. "Like you but, not you." There was no mockery in his tone, only a puzzled tenderness. "How?" Sifa asked. The word left her throat like a stone thrown into still water. Her fingers reached for the dressing table but found only the cool glass of the mirror and the stinging reality of being examined. The photograph was a thread that tugged at hidden seams. Sifa learned in those hours that followed that portraits could be doors. Halima told a story that was stripped down and precise. Amina, the girl in the photograph, had been a worker in Halima's household decades ago, a bright girl from a village who had come to the city with dreams the size of her hands. She was young, and she had loved beyond propriety. It had been messy then, like any secret, and had been settled with a small, quiet sweep of things. Halima's voice was neutral because she had practiced neutrality for years. She had catalogued decisions and stored them in closets like winter clothes. "You should know," Halima said to Sifa, her eyes on the clock as if time itself might give the right punctuation. "Family remembers things better than people do. You are not the only one to carry a face." Sifa felt the world rearrange itself under her feet. Memories that had been private, carefully folded and locked, fluttered open. She had grown up with a mother who stitched stories into seams and a father who would whistle a tune like a bribe. Her mother's lullabies had been prayers pretending to be gossip. There had always been a missing piece, a puzzle she had avoided because finding it meant changing the picture of who she thought she was. That night, she sat up late with Halima's words like a new dress. Too large, too formal. She combed through childhood like a strand of beads, counting the times she had overheard people say, "There was trouble," or "It was settled." The photograph was a hinge that opened to a room she had not known existed. The compound's quiet turned from hospitality to observation. People moved like reed instruments tuned to the same key. Sifa felt both welcomed and weighed. When the house went to sleep, Idris was different. He was not the man at the stall with tea and shy questions. He was a man with a family that had fingerprints on more than one old secret. He sat next to her on the bed and held her hand, not with the casual propriety he had maintained, but with an urgent, frightened tenderness. "Tell me everything," he said, and in his voice was a plea she had not anticipated. He wanted the whole map. He wanted to know the trails that had made her. Sifa told him what she could. She told him about a childhood that tasted of millet porridge and market mornings, about a mother who had been both cruel and brave, about a father who had left footprints in distant towns. She told him about the one night when neighbors said a woman had walked away and never been seen again. She told him about the small ways people built themselves into new skins. Idris listened like a man piecing together an instrument, his brow furrowed as if counting beats. But there are things you cannot say aloud, even when the person across from you has hands that look like homes. Sifa kept some things folded tight, the exact shape of the rumor that had been her childhood's shadow, the reason she had learned early to paint on armor, the men who had once believed they owned her silence. She did not tell him about the night a cousin of her mother had tried to claim a debt of affection. She did not tell him about the time someone had tried to take the stall in goods and in pride. Some stories belong to a person until they do not. Idris kissed her forehead with a softness that made something in her unclench. "We will find out," he promised, a line that wanted to be a map. "Whatever this is, we will find the truth." Sifa wanted to believe him. In the mirror's reflection she saw a woman caught between two rooms, one filled with the smell of fried plantain and the other perfumed with lemon oil. Her makeup gleamed like a flag. She smoothed it with an index finger, a ritual she had followed her whole life. A sweep of powder, a correction of brow, a setting of lips. It steadied her the way prayer steadied others. The armor felt necessary. Later, when the servants had closed the heavy curtains and the chandelier reduced itself to a faint star, Idris rose and left the room for a long time. Sifa waited, listening to the house breathe. She thought of the photograph and of the name Amina, which seemed to slip through the cracks of her history and land at her feet like evidence. She turned the image over again and again, searching for clues that might connect that smiling woman to the woman who had been taught to hide a life beneath bright colors. When he came back, his face was unreadable. He closed the door with a slow, deliberate hand and then, in a motion that startled her more than 1,000 words, he slid the bolt into place. The click sounded like a gavel, small, final. For a moment the only sound in the room was their breathing, measured and shared. Sifa's fingers hovered over the mirror's edge. The makeup on her face felt heavier than before, as if it carried not only the pigment of red dust and berry but also the gravity of inherited questions. She never took off her makeup. She had never wanted to be seen without it. Tonight, though, something about the locked door made the armor feel like an accusation. It was as if the act of shelter, closing the world out, demanded an honesty that had been postponed. Idris turned and looked at her. His eyes were full of a tenderness shaped by worry. "Sleep," he said, but it was not an order. It was a request wrapped in fear. Sifa found herself considering small, sudden things. The way the bolt felt when it caught, the way the photograph had been placed like a stone to sink her into new water. She thought about the long road that led to the city house, about the swing of the mango trees and the kitchen's warm light. Her mind replayed every small kindness and every whisper that had built their promises. Her hand, the same hand that had pushed a brush of powder across her cheek that morning, rested on the dressing table. She did not reach to wipe the makeup away. Outside, the courtyard was quiet. Inside, the chandelier blinked. The locked door made the room into two things at once: shelter and cage. Sifa felt both protected and exposed, like a bird behind glass. "Don't you want to?" Idris began, then stopped. He did not finish the sentence because it had all the weight of a test. There was so much compressed into the idea of removing makeup. Intimacy, trust, the promise that flaws would be forgiven and scars would be loved. For Sifa, It also meant the possibility of being seen in a light that admitted hunger and shame and the wrongs of others. That possibility frightened her nearly as much as it tempted her. She looked at her reflection. The woman in the glass looked back with eyes that had learned to laugh and learned to hide. In the corner of the dressing table, the photograph of Amina seemed to grin like a ghost. Sifa touched her lips with the tip of a finger and felt the berry stain, permanent enough like history. Her decision might change everything. But at the very instant she moved to her face, to the tiny ritual that would announce a surrender or a trust, Idris stepped forward and closed the distance between them. He took her hands, warm, sure, and with a voice as small and fragile as a candle flame said, "Whatever you decide, I am not leaving." Sifa wanted to believe him with every part of her that had learned to survive. She wanted to believe that in a house full of portraits and secrets, a single soft promise could rewrite the rules. She wanted to lay down the armor and see what the world did when she stood without it. And yet the bolt held. The photograph waited. The night outside breathed slow and patient, like a beast calculating hunger. She had never taken off her makeup for anyone, not even for herself. And here, under a ceiling that held other people's choices, with a name from the past pressed into her present, she found the act of removing it more complicated than any of the markets, more decisive than any wedding vow. She let her hands fall to her lap. The makeup remained. The question remained. Idris sat beside her, thumb tracing small moons on her wrist, his breathing steady, his eyes claiming the room like an oath. Behind the locked door, secrets rearranged themselves like furniture in the dark. The photograph propped against the mirror stared back, and the house, with its servants and its chandeliers and the slow tick of its clock, waited for the next move. Outside, birds called the early hour to a country that never truly slept. Inside, a woman who had always been careful about what she allowed anyone to see, breathed in the scent of lemon oil and jasmine and the memory of red dust. She had been brave enough to marry a man who loved her, but bravery had contours she was still learning. The bolt clicked again, a small, final sound, and the room settled around them. There are many ways a story can begin to untangle. Some threads you pull and everything comes with it. Others you touch and the knot only tightens. On that night, with a photograph that remembered a different life and a bolt that made decisions audible, Sifa understood she had reached a hinge. She had stepped across a margin and into a house where her past might be a door and not just a shadow. She never took off her makeup. Not yet. Not until the world outside the black iron gate and the ledger of family secrets answered back. Not until she knew what she would look like when there were no more masks to put on. When morning came, it did not come gently. It barged in between the curtains like a guest who had stayed too long, spilling a pale, stubborn wash across the bed. Sifa woke to the sound of distant traffic and the soft clank of someone setting down a tray. Idris was gone. The bolt glinted in the sunlight like a small, honest thing. For a second she lay very still and let the world tick. The chandelier's shadow, the photograph leaning by the mirror, the faint perfume of lemon oil that lived in the seams of the room. She thought of the photograph again. Mina. The name had threaded itself into her dreams and sewn them into a single fabric where faces overlapped. Sifa rose and moved to the dressing table as if following a breadcrumb trail of questions. She reached for the photograph and felt, briefly, the weight of someone else's memory. On its back there were faint pencil marks she had not seen in the dark. A date, a place, an address that hummed like an electrical wire. Her fingers trembled. Not because she feared the truth but because she feared what finding it might do to the future Idris had promised. Downstairs, the house smelled like boiling tea and new plans. Voices folded into each other. Halima's precise alto directing servants, a cousin's laugh, the low murmur of radio chatter. Sifa dressed with the same careful art she always used. Powder, a steady brow, a lip color that read like punctuation. She left just enough armor for the world, but beneath it was a tide beginning to roll. At breakfast, the family moved like a machine well-oiled in pretense. Halima spoke of small things, the weather, the price of flour, as if those topics could stitch a garment over the rawness threaded beneath. Idris watched Sifa over his cup of tea with an expression that was part apology, part vow. He kept reaching across the table, touching her wrist with fingers that wanted to help but also seemed to be measuring how much help they were allowed. "Will you come with me to the office today?" Idris asked, and the question sounded like an attempt to reroute the future he had already begun to unspool. Sifa hesitated. The idea of meetings and polished floors made the photograph seem both ridiculous and huge. "Yes," she said finally. "I will come." They drove through streets that smelled of diesel and mangoes, through neighborhoods where the city's different faces rubbed shoulders. Vendors with piles of oranges, men repairing radios under a shade, laundry strung like flags. Idris's office was in a building that reflected the sky in panels of glass. Inside, his colleagues greeted him with the warmth of people who keep their kindness on schedules. He introduced Sifa as his wife, and people smiled the way the sun smiles when it's supposed to. Sifa answered in small sentences and learned the contours of a conversation that did not belong to her childhood. She watched Idris move through his world. Quick, efficient, a man used to doors opening when he approached. At noon, Idris asked if he could show her something. He took her to a small archive room behind a hallway lined with certificates and framed diplomas. There, with more formality than the photograph deserved, he opened a drawer and took out a bundle of papers tied with a red string. These were family records, he said. Old things he had been told to keep. Sifa watched him as he untied the string. The papers smelled like dust and old ink. Among them were letters, brittle envelopes, handwriting with the slow patience of a different era. There was even a small folded note in a language Sifa's grandmother used to hum when she wanted something kept secret. "Your grandmother knew Amina," Idris said, his voice low. "She was in the old files. These are mostly accounts, but there are names." Sifa's heart was a drum. The surface of things had always been paper-thin. Here it seemed to thicken into a ledger. She read slowly, the way one reads a map left in a pocket. Dates, small notations of settlement, arrangement, paid, and then oddly, a few lines in Halima's careful script that read more like a note than a transaction. Amina looked for her daughter, stopped. Left with sack. Paid off. Safe. Safe. The word looped in Sifa's mind like a question mark. She had been safe by some accounts, unsafe by others. How had a girl from a village become a line item in a city family's books? Idris watched her read, and in his face was a confusion laced with a kind of shame. "I didn't know all of this," he admitted. Halima said only what she needed to. "There are things hidden in paperwork." Sifa folded the letter and slid it back into the drawer. She felt suddenly as if she had been reading a map of someone else's life and discovered it had been a map of her own. Outside the polished building, the city continued, indifferent and busy. Inside, Sifa felt a slow tectonic shift. That afternoon, the family returned to the compound, and a visit was arranged that made Sifa's stomach drop like a stone. Halima wanted to take her to an old neighborhood where, she said, some people who once worked for the family still lived. Sifa's chest tightened. Was this hospitality or a slow excavation? She went because sitting and not knowing seemed worse than walking into the unknown. The neighborhood was a different city. Alleys of mismatched bricks, laundry-like banners between closely leaning houses, children playing with improvised toys. Halima walked with the weathered gait of someone returning to check off a list. People greeted her with a reserved openness, nodding as if she were a returning official. Sifa felt like an intruder in her own life, every step a small reclamation. They entered a house with a green door that had lost paint in the places where hands had pushed it open 1,000 times. The woman who answered was small and had eyes like tinned copper, bright, resilient. Her name was Mama Barua. She held Halima's hands like someone testing their temperature. "You were always good to Amina," Halima said, almost as if confirming a fact. Mama Barua's mouth turned like a hinge. "Yes," she answered. "She worked here. Quiet. Hard." Her voice was slow as if memory made speech heavy. The air between the women was full of things not said. Mama Barua gestured and someone brought out a box. Not fancy, but with small trinkets folded inside like gewgaws of a remembered life. There was a battered comb, a faded scarf, a small tin with the remnants of a perfume that might have been lemon or jasmine. She handed Sifa a small bracelet made of seed beads, rough but whole. "This was hers," Mama Barua said. Sifa touched the beads and felt them like an anchor. The bracelet fit her wrist like an answer she had been carrying without knowing it. Did she have a child?" Sifa asked, the question escaping as a thin reed. Mama Barua's eyes softened. "Yes, they said she left with a baby. She said she was going to find a way. She had pride. Too much pride for some people." Her words came wrapped in the gravity of someone who had seen the world take what it wanted and leave the rest. Sifa's mind became a carousel of images. A small child's fingers, a woman walking away with a sack, a city swallowing a name. The bracelet tightened its hold. She had a sudden flash. A lullaby her mother had hummed that had a line Sifa now heard differently, a line about a child who would return one day. The puzzle moved, pieces clicking. Back at the compound that evening, Sifa confronted Halima, not with accusation but with a kind of desperate hunger for truths that carried the same weight as prayer. "Was Amina my mother?" she asked. Halima looked at her for a long moment. The room held its breath. Then, very carefully, Halima spoke in a voice that sounded as if it had been carved from long practice. "Amina was like a daughter to us," she said. "Not by blood. She came to work when she was young. She loved someone. The wrong man for this family. Things happened. We gave her a small compensation and sent her away for her safety. Left. We believed she had taken the child to her village. We tried to help. Life moved on. But if she took the child," Sifa began. "We thought she had gone back," Halima interrupted, and there was a brittle quality now, like a wrapper snapped. "We did not know she stayed in the city or if she survived." Her eyes softened and an admission slipped through. "We did not look as hard as perhaps we should have." It was a sentence that was not an apology and not a denial. It was an outline of neglect that fit around a heart. There was an underlying admission. Amina had been someone the family had once steered away, and later, when consequences came, had been folded into a story convenient enough to live with. Sifa felt something in her chest unfasten. Grief, yes, but also a strange relief. A blank space in the map had a name to it now. She held the bracelet like a flag. The days that followed were a slow unwinding. People at the compound treated Sifa differently now. Some with a softer politeness as if acknowledging a previously unacknowledged debt, others with an awkwardness that secret keepers carry like old coats. Idris stood by her with a loyalty that became visible like a healing. Together, they began to retrace the path that had been left blank in her life. They visited government records, talked to women who remembered a young worker's laugh, and dug through archives that smelled of time. Somewhere among signatures and ledger entries, they found a notation referring to a small house near the river where Amina had spoken of heading. It was the kind of clue that is both a promise and a risk. Sifa returned to the village, finally, with Idris at her side. The red earth welcomed her like an old song. Her mother's eyes were wide and tired, and when they met, Sifa felt the current of a childhood finally finding an outlet. There were things unsaid between them, apologies that would need to be grown into, but there was also a space for the truth to breathe. At the edge of the village, beneath the mango trees that had listened to her laughter and her silence, Sifa found a woman sitting on a wooden stool, a young man's cap in her lap, and a bundle of photographs spread like spoils. Her hands shook as Sifa approached. When the woman looked up, their eyes connected in a way that needed no translation. It was a meeting of time and consequence. "Sifa." Her mother's voice was a thread. "Yes," Sifa answered. "It's me." They embraced like two halves finally agreeing to be whole. The woman's breath came ragged and then steady. There were tears, yes, and there were questions. In the end, the truth was less a dramatic reveal and more a slow return. Amina had been someone the city wanted to forget, a woman whose choices had been judged and then silenced. She had indeed left with a child for a while. Whether that child had found safety or misfortune varied in the stories. The city kept contradictory versions like people collect stamps. The twist that reshaped everything came not from a dramatic confession but from a document. In a government office they found an adoption record. A file that had been filed quietly, legally, because a woman named Amina had wanted to protect her child from a life that the city's gossip would make harder. She had, the paper said, given her child to a teacher in a neighboring district to raise, with the agreement that if the child ever returned, the teacher would bring her news. The teacher's name was there, and in small print, an address. Sifa needed a moment to breathe. The idea that she had been hidden was both an erasure and a protection. It explained lullabies that had carried a double message and the emptiness her mother had made into a shape. They found the teacher, now an old man who still kept neat records and had a memory sharp as a blade. He remembered Amina as a woman who loved like a fire and feared like a dove. He had kept the child because the child was small and because Amina had made a decision she believed would keep her safe. "She told me to keep her name alive," the teacher said, and there was a tenderness in his voice like someone who had guarded a candle through a storm. When Sifa finally sat with the teacher, he handed her a letter Amina had written but had never sent. It was full of simple, brave things. Promises to come back, instructions for what to do if she could not, a list of favorite songs, and a plea that her child be loved. Sifa held the paper and felt the years like a cloak fall away. The armor she had learned to wear, the shawl of makeup, was not a rejection of love but a method of keeping herself together until she could make sense of the world. Now she had names and papers and a lineage stitched from both shame and protection. That night, under the mango trees, Sifa took off her makeup. Not as surrender, not as a gift to anyone, but as a reclamation. She washed her face and let water take the colors away like a small, private cleansing. She looked at her reflection, a woman who had been fought for and fought with, a woman braided by history and choice. Idris sat beside her, his hand finding hers, and in that touch there was no demand, only company. "You don't have to hide," he said. "No," she replied. "But I will choose when to show." She smiled then, a soft, honest thing. The city's papers could not rewrite her laughter. The photograph on the dressing table had been a key. Now it was a door she could open or close on her own terms. Sifa had found memory and with it a choice, to keep her face a shield or to let it be soft sometimes. Both could belong to her. Halima came to Sifa later, with a small bowl of spices and an apology that was awkward but true. "We did not mean harm," she said. "We were afraid. We were wrong." There was no perfect restitution, but there was a beginning. The family offered help, not charity but recognition, and Sifa accepted in measured doses. It would take time to untangle all the knots, to repair relationships, to speak the names aloud without shame, to teach the village and the city that certain truths can coexist with dignity. When the village drums called once more for a small celebration, not a wedding this time, but a homecoming of sorts, Sifa stood under the mango tree with the bracelet of seed beads around her wrist and the teacher's letter folded in her pocket. She looked at the people she loved and the people who had loved in complicated ways. She saw her mother's eyes, tired but steadier. She saw Idris's face, open and unguarded. She felt, finally, that her life was as much about the way she chose to be seen as about the way the world had once chosen for her. She had never taken off her makeup until he locked the door on their wedding night, but she had always chosen what to keep close to her chest. Now she chose freely. Some nights she would wear it as armor. Others she would let her skin breathe in the honest light. The choice itself became the gift. The photograph remained on the dressing table, but instead of being a ghost it became a map, one that she could follow back sometimes and lay aside at will. She had not only found Amina in paper and memory, she had found a version of herself that could both remember and forgive. The bolt on the door had been a small beginning to a long unfastening. Outside, the mango leaves whispered like old friends. Inside, Sifa slept without powder in her hair for the first time in a life that had long demanded she be prepared for every storm. In the quiet between breaths, she dreamed of a child's laugh, a laugh that might be hers to keep this time.